Hello and welcome to today's broadcast of Make Politics Interesting. With me, your host, Davina, I'm going to be talking about some various trending topics. Womp womp is in reference to a few different things, but you may have also noticed that Brazil had an attempted coup that is very much a mirror image of what happened on January the 6th in 2021 in the United States, except that after this violent attempted overthrow of the government, a lot of people were arrested on scene. And we can look at a little footage of some of those people being led away in handcuffs and put on buses. What else have I talked about? Oh, the Office of Congressional Ethics, where Kevin McCarthy is purportedly going to lead a first vote in the House of Representatives to abolish the House of Congressional Ethics, i.e. abolish a system of holding corruption to account, a way to abolish the public being able to make formal complaints about the behavior of corrupt politicians. So once again, we see Republicans sabotaging oversight and still benefiting from something that I would like to call white wrongdoing and amnesia, or the creation of a false kind of loyalty. When you group people around being loyal to the protection of the status quo, you're creating false bonds between people that makes them willing to overlook incredible amounts of corruption and malfeasance because they feel united. They've created bonds of attachment to people like Trump, to the Republican Party as a whole. They've created a sense of unity in falsely condemning Democrats and ascribing to them all sorts of projected accusations of wrongdoing that are typically confessions. So let's have a look at this BBC article published 3 hours ago, and today is Monday the 9th of January. And the title of this article is How Trump's Allies Stoked Brazil Congress Attack. So here we see some people wearing Bolsonaro colors of, Brazilian colors actually, of green and yellow. And they're calling them protesters, but they're the same as the insurrectionists on January the 6th. People brought in as a way to make a coup look legitimate, to make a coup look like the will of the people. So it says protesters smash windows. I'm going to call them insurrectionists. Insurrectionists smash windows as they invade the presidential palace in scenes reminiscent of the US Capitol riot in January 2021. There are deeper connections as well. The whole thing smells, said a guest on Steve Bannon's podcast one day after the first round of voting in the Brazilian election in October of last year. Well, we now know even before the election, Steve Bannon was just being part of that Trump coup plot and telling Chinese visitors that Trump was just going to declare victory either way. So regardless of the election outcome, Trump was going to declare victory, and that was going to be a strategy for remaining in power independently of the democratic process, i.e. despotically taking control of the US government. So the race was heading towards a runoff. The final result was not even close to being known in October of last year. Yet Mr. Bannon, as he had been doing for weeks, spread baseless rumors about election fraud. He and his guests stoked up allegations of a stolen election and shadowy forces. He promoted the hashtag Brazilian Spring and continued to encourage opposition even after Mr. Bolsonaro himself appeared to accept the results. So there you go, Mr. Bannon, part of the plot to foment violence and opposition to the rule of law and opposition to the results of the 2020 presidential election. He was part of undermining democracy in Brazil as well. The day before January the 6th, Mr. Bannon had told his podcast listeners all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. So he knew he was in on the schemes for violence, and he was a key player in driving that violence and driving those mechanisms to incite a violent outlook on the part of audience members. So whichever audience member has a sufficiently high baseline level of grievance that they could be potentially activated to come to January the 6th coup effort, then that's what Bannon was part of doing. I'm part of the counter movement towards that. I talk to people in hope to activate people with a high baseline level of decency so that they feel motivated to pass on the baton of talking about politics, not giving the silence of our consent to the people who are prepared to lie and steal and distort information and conflate problems with being existential threats and pretend that there's some kind of white replacement genocide that could happen, and basically imply that interracial marriages and migration will result in the elimination of whiteness, as if that's an outcome that involves the death of white people, when it doesn't. Racial intermarriage or ethnic intermarriage, race is all a social construct in any case. It's an arbitrary construct. It's made up. This white skin is not pure white in any case. And if my children were to have a different skin color to me, I wouldn't die as a consequence. My children would not die as a consequence. It's not true genocide. Nobody's being replaced. We're evolving into a better form of a multi-pluralistic society whereby people value each other for character and personality traits that complement each other and things like that. Like a good basis for marriage, and not saying you're white, I'm white, let's get married to perpetuate white greatness. The false conflation of greatness with the quality of whiteness is a big fallacy that has long roots and long shadows and persists unless we directly challenge it and culturally challenge it. All right, so figures involved in January the 6th are currently applauding what's happening in Brazil. They're saying the National Supreme Court is illegitimate, blah, blah, blah. This is Ali Alexander, I presume high school educated chap who just learned how valuable his skin color was in a tokenistic sense to right-wing white supremacists, because they could whitewash their white supremacy through use of a reasonably articulate and passionate seditionist such as Ali Alexander, who would speak out and ascribe all sorts of terrible qualities to the Democrats and Biden and democracy as it functions in the United States in order to advance the cause of the status quo co-conspirators who want to preserve white wealth dominance and have underregulated corporate activity and no taxes, and they prefer chaos to cohesive societies. Oh, that reminds me of Hakeem Jeffries, the new House of Representatives minority leader, who made a speech which included an alphabetic recitation of democratic values and a renunciation of various themes of the Republican Party in its current iteration. And we might have a listen to that because it lifts us. We can't just restrict ourselves to pointing out and critiquing the nascent fascism of the Republican Party and Trumpism. We have to make sure we are also showing what we stand for, because we have to bring people together and strengthen a coalition in opposition to those who would destroy our society, or whether it be rapid destruction or gradual destruction over time. The people who want to do us harm need us to not only recognize that they are intent on harm, regardless of the values they spout. But we also need to be strong in articulating our own values so that we are clear in being a beacon and a light to others, a light for people to gather around. You have to have a strong coalition of goodness when you hope to defeat the kind of people who wanted January 6th to succeed. All right. Bolsonaro supporters railed online about an existential crisis and a supposed communist takeover. Exactly the same type of rhetoric that drove the rioters in Washington 2 years ago. Now let's revisit that because what is that? We'll revisit it because, yes, they complain about there being a communist takeover, and they complain, what else do they complain about? Communist takeover, inflation's terrible. And the thing that will be under discussed at the moment is the fact that inflation is getting kicked in its butt. Prices might still be high of some goods, but overall, the rate of increase of inflation has drastically slowed. House prices are not rising. The Fed's determined increase of interest rates has definitely put the kibosh on house prices. And that's definitely putting the brakes on some types of economic activity. Real estate transactions are a big part of economic activity. The federal bank has kind of brought some of that activity to a screeching halt. So other parts of the economy are doing well. There's like historically low unemployment rates, which is amazing. And typically, unemployment rates being that low would put a high upward pressure on wages. We want wages to be increasing, but the fact that they haven't increased that much is fueling a degree of confidence in the business world. So they're happy. People have the opportunity to get a job depending on where they live and what their needs are and what their skill sets are. But there's some jobs available. The basement of wages hasn't been set very well. So I'm sure you know that Senator Kristen Sinema of Arizona was one of the decisive votes in preventing there from being a $15 federal minimum wage. And we don't want to put small pressure on small businesses that much, but we do want workers to be compensated in a way that allows them to live without being dependent on welfare. So the working class welfare is kind of a contradiction in terms of successful societies. You shouldn't really need to have food stamps if you have a job. But there are some jobs which can legally in America pay so little that you can spend most of your waking hours working and still struggle to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head for yourself and your family. And that's a function of how successful conservative politicking has been since the era of Reagan and the era of amplifying unfounded race hate to make people suspicious of the welfare state. Those gains that America made since the era of Roosevelt, when it became accepted that misfortune happens to people and that if you support them during their moments of misfortune, you can help provide them a solid base from which to lift themselves up. And that having a system of disability payments, unemployment payments is really helpful to a cohesive society because you don't have to be so afraid of misfortune. You don't have to live your life disdaining the people who are languishing in the gutter because that's the only way you can cope with not helping them. All right. So yes, Reagan definitely abused the simmering levels of racial resentment against Black Americans by abusing anecdotal stories of one particular woman who was described by Ronald Reagan as a welfare queen. But in her real life, she was much more than someone who abused the welfare system. She was a kingpin villain who could pass as white and could pass as a bunch of different races, and ran a whole bunch of different con artist schemes, and may have been guilty of participating in various murder and extortion schemes. Like, she was an extraordinary woman. Let's find her name, the real welfare queen, because there's been some more investigations about it in recent years. Linda Taylor. Here we go. But yes, Reagan implied she was a Black woman able to just abuse the welfare system. She didn't just abuse the welfare system. She abused a bunch of systems. She was an extraordinary supervillain and not an example illustrative of exploitation of the welfare system. No, she's a special case. But Reagan fanned those flames to abuse racism as a strategy for political advancement. And ever since then, Republicans have been able to get a sufficient stranglehold on the American political system to help undermine American achievements in the department of having a strong social safety net. And Democrats endeavor to mitigate that effect and to help people make peace with the idea of helping everybody in the United States, and not trying to oppose the Republican lead. A lot of Republican governors refuse to expand Medicaid, i.e. refuse literal money offered by the federal government to have health insurance and access to health services for more people. They're like, no, that will spoil Americans if we let relatively impoverished people have access to healthcare. So we refuse the expansion of Medicaid. We refuse to expand the criteria for eligibility to Medicaid. We don't want it. We're all independent. We're too independent to accept that help. And those are relatively wealthy Republican governors making those decisions for the poor people in their states. So people in Mississippi and Missouri, in all manner of Republican-governed states, have so much forced unnecessary suffering as a consequence. Really, that example should be talked about a lot more. The outcomes of voting for Republicans. You have people who get hurt as a consequence. You have rural hospitals that close. You have so many people denied access to federal help, and they're taught to resent the federal government as a consequence, or to resent migrants, or to indulge in their basest racial hatreds, rather than find a clear answer that Republicans rejected Medicaid expansion. It's really quite simple. Their stubbornness and their resolve to misrepresent how government should work. They're like, no, if we let poor people have access to healthcare, then that's like loosening our belt, and we've got to tighten our belt to run a tight ship. I'd love to interview people from red states, Republican-governed states, who were suffering as a consequence of unexpanded Medicaid access. But there's somebody who's done that work for me. It's Jonathan Katz, and he wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness. So what I should do is read extracts for people each broadcast. Just read a little bit of an interview with someone who says, right, yes, I'm dying of liver failure. I could survive if I had access to certain medications, but I don't want that, because that would mean I live in a state that allowed Mexicans to have this access to healthcare as well. So I'd rather die than have that kind of state government that allowed that. And it's extraordinary to see how people will consent to their own unnecessary death as a way to defend a status quo established by a Republican governor trafficking in disinformation. All right. So I think we've gone through the story. Here is a supporter of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro clashing with security forces as they raid the National Congress in Brasilia. I think Bolsonaro is in Florida at the moment, because I've seen people advocating online for a cancellation or a failure to renew his tourist visa. He's currently in America on a tourist visa. I think they last for 30 days. Oh, wow. A banner displayed by Brazilian rioters on Sunday declared, "We want the source code," in both English and Portuguese, which is a reference to rumors that electronic voting machines were somehow programmed or hacked in order to defeat Bolsonaro. Wow. But yes, unlike the January 6th insurrection, President Lula has already been inaugurated, and we can listen to a little bit of Bolsonaro's tear-streaked and self-pitying final address before he headed to Florida last week. All right, let's hear.
If I got this far, there was a purpose.
Teve propósito. Se você está chateado, está constrangido,
If you are upset, concerned, put yourself in my shoes. How many times I ask myself where I went wrong, what I could have done better.
eu tenho feito melhor. Eu tenho a convicção, deu o melhor de mim.
I am convinced that I gave the best of myself, with the sacrifice of those by my side, especially my wife.
Estava ao meu lado, em especial minha esposa.
All right, so he's convinced he gave the best of himself. Imagine how he feels. The Bolsonaro rioters demanding a source code, and some of their banners are in English. Let's have a look at that. Oh, we want the source code. Yep. The banners in Portuguese and English. Look at them. Doesn't that really remind you of January the 6th? Just a mass of people, and they're all angry, and they're all angry because their anger has been fueled by the repetition and recitation of falsities about the election.
O Supremo é o povo.
Oh, he's been admitted to hospital. When is that story from? It's the top story on the BBC website. He's got abdominal pain. Let's just look for a publication date. 1 hour ago. And also artwork has suffered irreparable damage in Brazil riots. Yeah, they've probably damaged valuable artwork in the Capitol building. In the same way that pro-Trump insurrectionists caused a lot of damage to valuable things in the Capitol building. All right, so he's admitted to a hospital near Orlando. Okay, so he's probably experiencing some stress, and it's reactivating his problems with abdominal pain because he was stabbed in 2018. So he's under observation and his condition is not worrying. Well, maybe he's also being asked to, well, he's trying to have a condition that will help him retain a visa to stay in the United States. Because President Joe Biden is facing pressure from members of his party to remove Bolsonaro from the country. Bolsonaro should not be in Florida, said Democratic Representative Joaquin Castro. The United States should not be a refuge for this authoritarian who has inspired domestic terrorism in Brazil. He should be sent back to Brazil. Okay, and the US has received apparently no official request from the Brazilian government relating to Mr. Bolsonaro's visa. All right. Okay, so he's in hospital. His tummy hurts. Not to minimize his suffering, but yeah, and he wants to stay in the United States at the moment. All righty. Now I'm going to switch to looking at Twitter for a little bit. Because I promised to do a womp womp story. Womp womp, still trending, so I guess people are just making that noise, which means dun dun, we don't care. But the nice womp womp that I'm following is that there was a case that right-wingers have been hyping as a case that will overturn the 2020 election, because we know Donald Trump's already lost over 60 court cases. So this one, he lost over 60 court cases even before January the 6th happened in 2021, because they were all abruptly brought to various courts, including the Supreme Court. I haven't even heard of this Brunson case. Background here, okay? Calling all Uncle Franks for a frank but respectful breakdown of how your right-wing media sources are simply not telling you the truth. This is the problem with Uncle Franks. All right. So I'm visiting a website about a legal podcast called Opening Arguments. So they thought that there was going to be a Supreme Court petition that would rewrite the history of American politics, except it won't. I have to click on a link for us. Andrew Torres and Thomas Smith are the lawyers behind that particular podcast. All right. Opening the Microsoft document. All right, well, something, but I can't really see. There's a January the 6th document, which presumably Republicans will take down when they can. All right. Control click. Committees are no longer standing. Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth, Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and Select Committee to investigate the January the 6th attack on the Capitol. Well, that's useful, but not strictly relevant. All right. Let's go back to some other point then. So I can't really follow that point about the court case. Oh, and this is the footage I promised earlier, that we would have scores. Look, 3.4 million people have seen this. Scores of Bolsonaro insurrectionists have been detained and arrive in handcuffs here to the jail. That's it. All these people on a bus with their hands behind their back, and their hands are behind their back, and they're wearing yellow and green. It's a police bus, and it's because they sought to overthrow the government. But that is the difference between January the 6th in the United States. The police there were suffering from a surfeit of friendliness, or possibly intimidation, by all the people who were attacking them and who had caused 140 police officers to be injured on that day. Hiccup. All right, so they arrived at the jail. That is exciting. I have a little bit of a cough, so I will stop this broadcast. But thank you so much for listening, and thank you to any replay viewers. So sorry. All the best. Take care and talk soon. Cheerio.